Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the webinar series hosted at the GSSI, the Global Sales Science Institute, which is a body that tries to bring together sales academics from around the world and to talk about what are they currently doing, either in the classroom or in their interactions with the companies in terms of sales. Today, we're going to have Professor Jobst Gorne from a business school in Aalen. And essentially, Professor Gorne has a lot of background and history in helping organizations that are in the heavy manufacturing side. And he's worked a lot with companies that have capital heavy in terms of equipment and how the organizations have changed in times with what's happening in the world as well. So Professor Gorne, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, Aalen is located in the southern part of Germany between Stuttgart and München, and it's a quite industrialized area with big companies, automotive industry, but machine building as well. Yeah. I'm quite happy to talk about machine building industry today, as this is a little bit peculiar and different from other industries.
Absolutely.
Building big machines, machinery is quite essential for the industry in many countries, because big machinery is used to produce energy, to drill for oil, to do iron ore mining, to build transportation means, roads, trains, airplanes, cars, etc. So even telecommunication depends on big heavy machines. Yeah. So it is important that this industry is doing well, having the power and strength to develop new solutions which will be more cost effective to their customer.
Indeed.
So today we are talking about something which has some meaning and is quite important.
Indeed. Especially in your part of the world, because when you mention Stuttgart, when you mention München, I was just thinking about the companies like Mercedes-Benz out of Stuttgart, or you're thinking about BMW. Of course, these are the more, what we say, the B2C kind of brands that many people are aware of. But there are, as you said, there are so many other companies that supply to these automotive industries. There are also so many companies out there which are heavy in B2B space that people have not even heard about, but which contribute to billions to the economy of not just Germany, but Europe, but of the world as well. So I think it's going to be very interesting to listen to your perspective on how the domain of heavy industry, for lack of a better word, is changed or is continuing to change as well. And you already mentioned that since it has a big impact on its economy, what are some of the other things that you're noticing in this industry? Are there any specific peculiarities or something specific to this industry that one should be paying attention to, especially when it comes to sales?
Well, the business approach, the sales approach has changed in the last 10, 20 years. Globalization was coming up in 2000. And of course, globalization increases the number of competitors.
Yeah.
So selling is more difficult, and customers have more choice, more pressure, and well, it's another tendency what we can observe worldwide, that purchasing has a high speed of professionalization.
Yeah.
Many companies add a lot of resources to their purchasing departments, and we have to keep up speed and trace to be able to sell at good margins and keep up business. Yes.
Indeed. It's very interesting because you mentioned a lot of things out there. So what is so obvious to you from your knowledge, but let's sort of unpack it for the audience. So you mentioned a couple of things. Let's probably begin with the biggest thing you said, the professionalization or the professional approach that the purchasing departments are going through. So can you be a little bit more specific about what is happening there?
Yes, in former times when there was still a balance between sales and purchasing, the normal sales situation was that the salesperson was sitting in front of one or two purchasing people, maybe a technical guy and the commercial buyer, and that was kind of equilibrium. And if you these days go and sell to big companies like Mercedes Benz or like other people, it can quickly happen that there is one salesperson sitting in front of 5, 10, 15 people, and all are very specialized and they're very good at what they know, and it is quite difficult to face their knowledge and to discuss with each. Often you have, of course, the buyer, then you have the project manager, then you have the quality manager, then there is the technological person, the designer is in, then there is a special guy who does nothing else but cost calculation. So he will tell you what your cost should be. You have to face that as well. And then there are some hierarchical people which are sitting there. That is quite challenging, and you need a lot of experience and knowledge and a good standing to face the situation.
Indeed. And I love what you're saying, is right, because just when you listed all this, you listed more than 7 or 8 names, and these are not even complete. Whereas if you take a look at a lot of research that says there are now 6.8 people in the customer's buying decision-making unit. But I think when we go into heavy equipment, it can even go up to 15 to 20, because the size of the orders can be so big, and it could be multi-year contracts, that actually your sales cycle times are much longer than even the 6.8, which is still, in my opinion, an average. Whereas in heavy equipment, it's probably going to be much higher than that as well.
Yeah, it can go up. Depends upon the project, depends
Absolutely.
upon the...
And one of the other things you mentioned, so essentially, as I said, so essentially what was so obvious to you was that you said the purchasing profession is becoming more, what can I say, professional, for lack of a better word. You also mentioned competition, right? And in the world of heavy machinery, where do you think competition is? Because is it true that you're having competition from normally what we would call low-cost countries, but actually they're coming out with better quality products that can compete with some of the old kind of Western kind of organizations as well?
Yeah, well, don't forget, for example, Europe, you have the traditional companies like England, France, Italy, producing heavy machinery. But don't forget Czech Republic. There has been a very well established heavy machine industry, partly in Slovakia. Maybe, well, I have to be a little bit cautious now. Maybe they have not been meeting the very highest standards. But the question always is, shall the customer buy a very expensive, doing everything, or shall he buy maybe 2 more simple machines? When one breaks, the other continues to work. So that is quite a question. And once, as a manufacturing company, you have developed to supply these very complicated, high efficiency machinery, you may have lost the ability of offering a cheap solution, simple solution to your customers. So this is not a very easy situation. When we look worldwide, of course, Japan has a very well developed industry. They are excellent engineers, and they know what is needed worldwide. So that came in the maybe 80s, 90s to Europe and to America, of course. These days you have Korea adding the market of heavy machinery,
Yeah.
and of course China, and they are quite strong, and they are beating the Europeans and the American competitors. Yeah, it's quite competitive and quite interesting.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things which I find very interesting in the fact that today, when you have this kind of customers who are becoming more professional, and you mentioned something very interesting, that somebody in a customer's organization who just does the cost calculation, and then they're probably at the end of the day, they're saying, okay, do I really want the really high quality, sometimes almost over-engineered products, as against, okay, it is good enough. In fact, I can buy two products or two machinery for the price of what I would get with the one very expensive one, and my cost could be lower. You see what I mean? And so essentially what I'm trying to say is that it brings that challenge to the salesperson about trying to justify the benefits and say, where is the true value when compared to the price, which could be much lower with some of the, what can I say, the cheaper cost countries. And here I'm looking at, as you said, the example that you gave of Slovakia or China, because at the end of the day, maybe some of the Korean manufacturers, because most of the Japanese heavy equipment manufacturers that I've come across are actually more expensive and even sometimes the Western one. So what are your thoughts on that one? Does it make the job of the salesperson that much more complicated?
Well, it changes the job of the salesperson. First, there should be change of mind. The salesperson should not look at the sales opportunity as an isolated sales. It should understand that on the other side there is a customer who has a need of production, and who has a need to satisfy at the end of the day his customers. So yes, when you want to sell, you have to be an absolute pro in cost calculation, but not only for your own products. You must understand what the cost situation and the production situation for your customer is. And then you may be able to derive arguments saying, okay, for the moment, this equipment I offer is more expensive, but let's look at the life of the equipment, say 5 or 10 years, whatever we talk about. And then the initial cost of purchasing becomes relative if there are other additional benefits for the customer, which help him to reduce maintenance, to get up efficiency, better reliability. Maybe they are ergonomic wise much better, and that people like more to work with this equipment, etc., etc. There is quite a number of arguments seen from the customer which can be added to the standard portfolio. Look at our technology, look how performant we are.
So this is very, very interesting, because there are a couple of things which I also want to unpack based on what you just said, but also from my experience of working with these kind of companies and everything else. Is you mentioned the fact that your price that a customer is going to pay for an equipment is at one point in time, but you mentioned something, but if the machinery is going to be operating for 5, 10, 15 years, there is going to be a component of services to it, right?
Absolutely.
And essentially what you're saying is that it's not about the cost of the equipment, but it's also taking a look at the total cost of ownership, the total cost of operation as well. So from my experience, Professor Gorne, what I've actually seen is that companies have two sales forces. I'm not saying they're successful, but they have a sales force that goes and sells the capital equipment or the heavy machinery. And then 6 months to a year later, we have what they call the aftermarket sales organization that goes to sell the value-added services. Now, in your opinion, how long can a heavy machinery manufacturer afford these two separate sales forces?
Well, I think that is a brilliant move if a machine manufacturer establishes two sales forces, because the sales tasks are completely different. Let's look at some equipment which would be needed, typically needed in a power plant, coal power plant, like a ball mill. This is a huge equipment measuring maybe 3 by 3 by 3 meters, having an electric drive of 6,000 kilowatt power. And this ball mill is milling down the coal pieces to dust, and they are blown into the boiler, burned, and create the energy. So this equipment may be worth, I'm not a specialist of ball mills, but they may be easy worth $5 million. So people are used to describe during sales the performance of that mill, the advantages, the life, etc., etc. And that is on the other side, on the purchasing side, there are sitting specialists for ball mills, which have studied all the specs of the ball mill manufacturers around the world. And they know how to compare and evaluate what is said from the sales department. And so this is one kind of battle. And maybe not in all cases, but I think still today, and maybe still the next 5 to 10 years, this purchasing team is charged with the task of buying the ball mill. When the ball mill, when they have taken their decision based upon arguments and rationalism, then they will hand over the installation and mainly the day-to-day operation of that ball mill to a completely other team. So this other team has different problems. They care, for example, for the noise. They may care for the space consumption. They may care for maintenance intervals, and they are charged of. This new team is charged of running the equipment 24 hours, 7 days, 12 months. So they need other support than just selling spare parts, you know. And this is why a second sales team may come in. And that sales team is not charged of selling 5 million big equipment. They are charged of selling $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 per year maintenance contracts. They are charged in selling spare parts before the machine has broken down, because they know what typically goes wrong inside the customer with the own equipment, etc. And it's quite a lot of administrative work to get prepared for the emergency situation. Once the emergency situation comes, telephone, internet may support, but spare parts need to be on place. And this is something that this second sales team knows very, very well, and can prepare an argument, and this is the second approach, selling the service.
So, Dr. Gorne, one of the things which I'm seeing as well is that, as you said, you have one team to look at the capital equipment, it's looking at CapEx and how to reduce CapEx. I'm now talking from the customer side. And the other team that is trying to look at OpEx and trying to reduce the operational expenditure, right? And now suddenly what we have is that it's two sets of teams, which means you need to have two sets of salespeople to actually go, and sales teams to go there. But I also hear more and more that companies are saying, well, you know what, I don't want to be fooled by this, because what happens is they may save money in the capital equipment side, but they may be hemorrhaging and losing money because they were paying a premium to actually get the maintenance contracts, mostly because the maintenance contracts is more kind of the people responsible for the maintenance contracts are the ones who are responsible for keeping the coal, in the example that you gave, the coal plant up and running. So for them, any loss because of the machine going down would mean that it's loss of productivity. So they don't care about the budget as much as making sure that they can get the output out. So, but at the end of the day, so that's pretty much why you see it's like typically what you see in the P2C is the example would be like, you know, you buy the Gillette razor. It's almost cheap to buy the razor, but then you make money on the cartridges. So, but if I am a smart buyer, and that is what is happening more and more, is they're saying we don't want to be surprised by two separate sales forces at two different points in time. I want, anytime I'm going to be looking at a capital equipment right now, I need the total cost of ownership calculated from the start. So which means how long do you think that this approach of two sales teams, which by the way, many capital equipment were too late to start with, but by the time they've started this, they don't have enough time because your customers now are learning from it. So in your opinion, how long do you think this approach of having two separate sales forces will work?
I think that will work still minimum 10 years. Look, the point is, I know from the big automotive companies which are constantly buying equipment, they do a perfect total cost of ownership. But total cost of ownership sounds simple, but to do it in real life is quite difficult because it can be cheated easily. And the customer promises anything, supplier promises anything, etc., etc. So if you want to have meaningful total cost of ownership, you need to have a lot of experience. Now look at the energy manufacturers. They are building a power plant now and the next in 5 or 8 years. So how can the purchasing team develop a very good expertise in this complicated TCO? It's not that simple. And I think that in this business, there is still today and for the next decade, the classical split, one team is buying the initial equipment and somebody else is caring for the day-to-day operational running.
Indeed. So, Professor Gorne, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you, in your opinion, if I say, what are 3 things that a sales manager in one of the capital equipment companies that you've had a chance to work with, what would be 3 pieces of advice you would give them?
Well, the first advice would be to split up his team into specialists for selling the initial equipment and others that do the maintenance contracts. And the second advice is maybe even to have 2 different sales managers, because behavior is so different, turnover is different, and margin is so different between selling initial equipment at just affordable margins and selling services where you're more or less unrivaled. There is no second manufacturer of the equipment you sell to a customer. So this is a good argument for high margins. But don't mix both. That would be my recommendation. Every team must be measured with its own measurements.
Indeed. So essentially you said one is have separate sales forces, which automatically would mean that have separate managers. Is there anything else that you would want to say as a kind of an advice to people who are watching this podcast?
I think both teams require different personalities from the salesperson. closing a $5 million contract is highly stressing, and you have to have a very, very tough negotiation skills, and you must be very hard, not easy to convince, not you should not panic, etc. I guess selling services where there is almost no, which is not completely true, but there is little competence, should be much more easy, and that's more work, good preparation, good system, and execute, travel, talk to the people, be kind, understand, the more common and more enjoyable sales.
Indeed. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Gorne. And essentially, I'm sure that the audience will appreciate essentially what looks very obvious, but it's not so obvious, the difficulty of selling capital equipment, where a lot of times, as much as we say, we give the example of the iceberg in the Titanic, capital equipment sales, the equipment sales might just be what they've said, for lack of a better word, the tip of the iceberg. But there's so much opportunity lying underneath that you will actually might need a separate sales force to unearth the potential there as well. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will try to make sure that the next person that we'll talk has as much insights as Dr. Gorne does. Thank you once again, Dr. Gorne.
Thank you, Professor Rangarajan. Thank you.